so we're going to take a look at the Sinclair Zx Spectrum, and we're going to follow the timeline through because this was the next model in Sir Clive Sinclair's series, and the ZX81 was the precursor to the ZX Spectrum, but we have to go even further back to follow the timeline, and that is to the MK14. And the MK14 was a commercial success. It sold between 15 and 50,000 computers. Next was the ZX80, which sold around 50,000 computers and again was a commercial success. And then it was followed up very shortly afterwards by the Sinclair ZX81, which is an iconic machine now, and it sold 1.5 million units. With this success of this machine, Sinclair was kind of riding high, so he brought out the ZX Spectrum, and the ZX Spectrum was another iconic machine, and it sold around 5 million units. And with the ZX Spectrum's success, Sir Clive had a hit on his hands, and it was an unexpected hit because you have to remember he's leaped from 1.5 million machines to over 5 million within the lifetime run of the ZX Spectrum. But the machine, which took the hearts of the UK and other places around Europe, also had its detractors. It also had its faults, and this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the timeline of the ZX Spectrum from development from Jim Westwood onwards, and Clive Sinclair's modelling and the way he wanted the ZX Spectrum to be seen was very different when you compare to how the Spectrum ended up being seen and used. So let's delve into the Sinclair ZX Spectrum.
British computing was a miraculous exception.
If it's got a keyboard, a manual and computer written on it, it'll sell. That's the word around the exploding market for personal or home computers that simply plug into a television set.
We're the world's largest producer of computers. We make more than the whole nation of Japan put together.
Right, so what did you get when you bought a Sinclair ZX Spectrum back in 1982? Well, the logo on the box is the grey keyboard, which is the original issue 1 keyboard, but most people ended up with the bluish tinted keyboard, and they never really changed the box style for a long time, and they kept the original graphics on here, but it's a little less dystopian than the ZX81 box. It's literally just a black box with a picture of the ZX Spectrum on the front. There's no kind of outlandish graphics, there's no early 1980 style line drawings. It's literally just a plain package, and you would get one of these machines inside of it. But on the back of the box it's very different. It's very reminiscent of the ZX81 in the way it's presented. It literally holds no kind of bars, as in the way it's telling you that this machine only includes, or this package only includes, the ZX Spectrum, the power supply, a demonstration cassette and a manual. That is it. It's not really showing you anything else. It's literally just telling you you may have to add a TV and a cassette recorder for loading and saving software, and it says your own cassette recorder for recording or playing back programs on an ordinary cassette. Now, they did very well in keeping it as simple and as honest as possible, and that was great because there's no outlandish claims on the packaging. There's none of this Vic for education, Vic for business, Vic for everything. It's literally saying this is what you bought. You bought a personal computer, and again, personal computer. It's not a home computer as far as he's concerned. It's a PC, a personal computer. Long before the PC moniker was tagged to the IBM machines. And as we turn the box over, the actual brilliant piece of marketing was, it was honest. The ZX Spectrum sat on the top is identical in size, to the picture of the ZX Spectrum underneath. There's no ambiguous, I thought it was bigger, or it doesn't look like it does on the box, and so on. It's exactly the same size, including the little rainbow marks match up. The whole lot is physically the correct size, which is a nice touch. I think that's a nice bit of marketing, because nowadays packaging promotes so much stuff that they could never ever achieve, and this is just, you've bought a ZX Spectrum. Simple. So we're going to take this Spectrum out of the way and just put it down here, and what we're going to do is we're going to open the box as if you just bought the machine. So the easiest way is just to take out the carton. Now once you've removed the packaging, you get the polystyrene inner carton with a nice embossed Sinclair logo, which is quite cool. It's quite nice. And then inside you'd have a ZX Spectrum here. What you would get is literally the computer itself. You would then get the Sinclair ZX Spectrum introduction guide, which is again very dystopian, very ZX81 kind of graphic style. And also you would also get the manual itself, which again wasn't a bad manual. It's very, very well done. It's got a lot of detail in this, stuff you would probably never need, especially initially, but it has an awful lot of detail in the manual. So putting the manual back in the box, it hasn't been out for a while, and the introduction guide, and you can see how neatly the whole machine was packaged. And then all you're left with is your power supply in here, and your ear and mic cassette leads, and also an RF lead. Now that's basically it. This one hasn't got its power supply in because I'm kind of fixing it because I don't trust them. I'm putting new innards in them, so that's why it's not in the box here. But it was just a standard 9-volt power supply. That's it. That's all you got in the box. There was nothing out of the ordinary. There was nothing to say that you, on the packaging, to say that you were getting something other than what you have been given or what you've bought, which is a fantastic way of looking at things, because today it's very, very different. And that's what you get in the box of your Sinclair ZX Spectrum. But one thing you'll notice about the ZX Spectrum is it didn't have much in form of expansion. It had an earphone and a microphone socket for loading and saving from cassette tape, and it also had an expansion card or a card edge, which was basically the circuit board, and everything had a direct line to just about everything on the computer itself. But that made peripherals relatively easy to build for this machine. So how did the machine, the Spectrum, compare to its contemporaries, or even the ZX81? Well, unlike a lot of other companies at that time, Sinclair was reducing the cost of the machine, but he wasn't actually trying to wring every last penny out of it in the same way Amstrad did with the later ZX Spectrums. What he was doing was reducing the chip count, and he did exactly the same process as he did with the Sinclair ZX81. He based it around a similar kind of principle. There was a ULA which did a lot of the functions on the machines. He also had a Z80 processor running at 3.25 megahertz. Then also he had 16 or 48K memory on the machine itself. The other chip on the board was the actual ROM, the basic ROM, and it's kind of followed the same lines as the ZX81, and it was quite a good piece of engineering. Now, one thing you've got to remember about this machine, unlike the ZX81, which didn't have sound, didn't have colour, didn't in its natural form have high-res graphics, although they did come later with some clever tricks, etc. The Sinclair Zx Spectrum did, and the Zx Spectrum had to have an improved ROM. Now, this improved ROM had to include new command sets. It had to include a new way of accessing the Zx Spectrum's new abilities, for example, colour. So the basic commands, if you kind of pardon the pun, were border, paper, ink. And basically that were really the limited commands that the Zx Spectrum used to change colours on screen. And it did a lot more under various other kind of machine code assembly and so on, but if you were using BASIC you would be predominantly using these commands. And then you had sound, and the sound on the Zx Spectrum was woeful at worst and tolerable at best. It used a single beeper speaker, and it was alright. I mean, you got to remember that, you know, before this machine you didn't have sound a lot on computers. You had the TRS-80 with no sound, the ZX81 with no sound, and it was kind of the way things were until the advent of the VIC-20, really, the ZX Spectrum, and a couple of other machines that were kind of out there at the time, including the early colour computers. But Sinclair, again, he was trying to drive the cost of ownership of computers down, so he went with a piezo speaker. So it was a beeper speaker which would produce kind of rudimentary sound. And it was fine for the time. You've got to remember, when these were out, there wasn't really a basis or a line for what we should be doing or shouldn't be doing in computers. So there was no baseline, and everything was kind of evolving almost on the fly. So that's how the machine started to evolve into the Sinclair Zx Spectrum. Now, because of the addition of commands that they put into this machine, obviously the ROM was upgraded, Sinclair BASIC was upgraded, and it was all designed to make things a little bit more accessible and a little bit more simpler for the first time user. So instead of the Microsoft BASIC that they used on the Commodore 64 with no real commands for colour or sound, and you had to use peeks and pokes and so on, well, the Sinclair Zx Spectrum went the completely opposite way, and it was almost being really overboard on user friendliness, and that was a big hit, and that really worked. So really the graphics on the ZX Spectrum were much superior to the ZX81. I mean, it used 256 by 192 pixels, which for the day was on par with just about every other 8-bit micro of the time. And again, it wasn't bad. It was kind of middle of the road, middle everything really. This machine was more middle than it was outstanding, and it was more middle than it was terrible. And that was probably the key to the computer's success. And the graphics had a few quirks. See, one of the biggest quirks was, well, it wasn't a quirk, but it can be seen that way now. It was the way it produced its character set. Now, most computers at the time had a character set built into ROM. It was basically a character set that wouldn't really allow much change. So you'd have, your A to Z, you want your 0 to 9, some special graphics and so on the keys, and that would be it. And on a lot of computers you wouldn't even have a lowercase, such as the Dragon 32. So the Dragon 32 generally operated in uppercase. I know the later Tanos and Dragons had a lowercase board that you could actually put into the machines and so on, and you could also do it retrofitted on the Dragon 32, but natively it didn't have lowercase, and neither did a lot of other machines out there at the time. Now, the way Sinclair did the Spectrum and its character set was vastly different to most other machines at the time, and it's part of the norm today. He was kind of a little bit ahead of his time when the ZX Spectrum was around with his thinking, because at the time the ZX Spectrum got a lot of criticism for the speed it produced its text. It was criticised for being a little slow. It was criticised for being a little kind of slow in reacting to drawing the screens. Now, that was kind of true. You know, you couldn't really get away from that fact, but it had upper and lower case, and because of this it made it a much more rounded machine than a lot of other machines. And the way it did this, it was basically software. It was drawn in the way that your modern PC draws its characters on the screen. It was kind of ahead of the 16-bit era, definitely ahead of the 32-bit era, and it was only then really that things started catching up. It was around the 16-bit and 32-bit era where people started to use basic graphics, basic drawings for characters. So that's why the Spectrum was slightly slower than a lot of micros on drawing a screen full of characters, a screen full of text rather, and that was a precursor to the way the modern machines actually work, and that's the way they work today. The other kind of quirk about the Spectrum were its graphics. Its graphics weren't bad for today. The colours weren't particularly garish in the same way they were on the Dragon 32 with its almost green palette, which kind of copied the TRS-80 colour computer. So it wasn't quite as garish, but it did have a few little quirks, and one of the biggest quirks was its colour clash. The colour clash on the ZX Spectrum was quite obvious. You couldn't really get around it without some very good programming and some very good shortcuts to allow it to get around this colour clash. And it was something that, you know, everybody at the time just thought, well, it's a Spectrum, that's what they do, and it wasn't a problem at the time. I think it's been more of a problem in its later years than it was when the Spectrum was in its heyday, but that's because of the way the colour cells work, and you have two separate colour cells as basically a block, and as they come close to another block, the colour bleeds in between the two different cells, and that's what the colour clash is. So you know, in a nutshell, you can't really do a lot about it apart from, you know, a few clever programming tricks and clever use of colours to kind of mask it. But at the time, really, it was accepted as a norm for a ZX Spectrum, and to be honest, it didn't affect things all that much. So kind of character sets aside, and you know, the way the Spectrum made up its character set, overall the ZX Spectrum was actually on par with most of the other 8-bit micros out there, with the possible exception of the BBC Micro. But what made the Spectrum such a hit? What endeared it to the British public? And, you know, what made, you know, a lot of British kids and a lot of European kids take this computer to their heart? Well, the biggest point of the ZX Spectrum was its software. The Spectrum was cheap enough, because of Sinclair's pricing, to sell units, and once you started selling units, software houses wanted to make software for it, and that always helps. A big software library is a big seller as far as a computer from that era is concerned. You wouldn't think that now with our modern systems such as Windows, or you know, if you're using Ubuntu even, or if you're using even Android, they've all got a huge library of software. You're not really going to be short of software for these machines nowadays, but back in the 80s, it was a very different era because every platform was incompatible with another, and every platform had to have its own software specially written for it. Well, the ZX Spectrum had a bit of a leg up because it was out before its arch rival, the Commodore 64, and it had a good year to develop a platform of software in the UK and parts of Europe, even before the 64 landed on these shores. So by the time the Commodore got onto the UK shores and a lot of parts of Europe, there was already hundreds if not thousands of games for the ZX Spectrum, and that makes a huge difference. And that's not the only thing that made the ZX Spectrum sell. You've got to remember the times. Basically, as I said before, you have machines that were silent, machines that were colourless, machines that were monochrome, machines that were more business and kind of tinkering orientated, you know, for hobbyists and so on. Now, the ZX81 and the ZX80 kind of falls into that category. The ZX Spectrum, though, was like basically a leap of colour off of a page. It was a cacophony of sound, well, kind of, with its little beeper speaker, and it was a game changer. It shifted things on quite a lot within the kind of computer arena. Now, the other big thing about the Spectrum is, apart from its sound and its colour and its price point, it's something you could go out and buy today. At the time, you could have just wandered into a high street store, very similar in the way the ZX81 was marketed, and that was places like WH Smith's. Walk in, have a play on it, get used to the rubber keyboard, look at the colour, do border and ink and play around with the sound on the ZX Spectrum, and then just buy one. Go out and buy one, take one off the shelf and take it home, or go in and have it as an upgrade to your already purchased last year ZX81. And that kind of makes a huge difference. And it's those differences that we don't think much of today. It's kind of normal that a computer can make sound. It's normal that a computer's got millions of colours, true colour video, and all this kind of stuff that we're kind of been used to for a long time now. But back in the 1980s, this was like going from a black and white television to colour. That's how big a leap it was. And going back even 2 or 3 years before the Spectrum was launched, it was like going from no TV and the radio to a black and white TV. There were big leaps, which we don't kind of see today, and we don't kind of, you know, realise that the leaps to get to where we are today in the early part of computer history were giant. They weren't tiny advances, they were giant leaps. And that's one of the biggest reasons that the ZX Spectrum was taken to heart. Plus, Clive Sinclair. Clive Sinclair was a person that people warmed to. He had this persona of being Uncle Clive. He had this persona of being the boffin in the shed. He had this persona of being very approachable.
Yeah. Japan and America have both, strangely as it may seem, failed to do anything like as well as Britain in the personal computer business. But what should be realised is that all those companies together, all of them, throughout Japan, make fewer computers than Sinclair Research on its own.
And, you know, whether or not it was a persona that he carried through into his normal life, that didn't matter, because that's what people saw, that's what people perceived, and that's what sold the computers as well. Now, on a little bit of an aside, Sir Clive Sinclair wasn't the grumpy person that it was made out to be in Microman. He was occasionally, and he was at times, but he wasn't all the time. And if you watch old interviews with him, he's quite often joking and being very personable.
Now, the other question that we had this from lots of people. Lovely machine, where are the manuals?
Well, I'm sorry about that. It was a blunder. We sent out some manuals with some of the pages missing. But that's all been corrected. Every single person that had a manual has had it updated.
You said it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And very approachable. And I think that came across throughout his kind of tenure with Sinclair Research. and his advertising and everything else that went along with these computers, and it definitely did him some good. And I also know from personal experience that he is a very personable person. He is, for want of a better word, very nice, and there's nothing you could say about him that really would match up to the depiction in other kind of videos such as Micromen, because it wasn't really 100% true. It was kind of for dramatization, dramatic effect, and you know, it kind of worked because that movie was good. But that's a bit of an aside, and we'll carry on with the ZX Spectrum. Now, one other thing was the fact that Sinclair and Acorn Computers and Sinclair Research were kind of arch enemies, if you kind of put it that way, at the time. But in reality, they had very little to do with each other after Chris Curry and Herman Hauser set up Acorn Computers. It wasn't as if they were at loggerheads every single day and so on, but you know, there were business rivalries, and it does overspill at times. And it overspilled to an effect that Acorn Computers would never ever admit that a Clive Sinclair product or a Sinclair Research product was any good. They were always kind of trying to distance themselves from Clive Sinclair, or making kind of noise that their computers were far superior and their computers were better and so on. Well, as far as the superior side of it, they almost certainly were, because they were built to a completely different mindset, a completely different specification, and for a completely different audience, or at least that's where they kind of ended up. But Herman Hauser, or Dr. Herman Hauser as he's known, was never known for admitting that a Sinclair product was good. And it wasn't until recently, some almost 40 years later, that he admitted that the ZX Spectrum was a good machine, and basically it was a very good engineering process and a very good marketing process that Clive Sinclair could actually get them out of the price point he was selling the machines at. And that was only admitted recently, but I'm guessing after roughly 38 years from Sinclair Research days to now, well, it's kind of water under the bridge a little bit. But you know, all of these old business rivalries probably still hold together with certain people anyway. But the ZX Spectrum wasn't a bad machine. It never was. And regardless of whichever way people tried to say it wasn't, such as the hit rivals such as BBC or Acorn Computers, Oric Computers, Lynx Computers, Jupiter Cantab and so on, when they were kind of out in the mix at the time, of course they were going to promote their own machine over another. But the machine which kind of won out all the way through that early kind of gold rush in computers was really the ZX Spectrum and Clive Sinclair's products. So, you know, the rivalry and the moodiness and everything else that you might have kind of seen on TV about Clive Sinclair and Acorn Computers, really, I don't think there was much animosity between either groups, to be fair. They both had similar trajectories and also similar failures as well, within their kind of relatively short period of the early gold rush era in computers. Now, one part of the Acorn narrative which kind of holds water, I mean, Chris Curry used to say that the Acorn machines were far superior to the Sinclair products, and you know, we've just said that in a lot of cases they were far superior, especially in technical abilities. But you know, Chris Curry also said that their machines were far superior because they were taken seriously. They were in the business market, they were in the educational market and so on. Well, that is also very true. The Spectrum didn't really make many inroads into the education market. It didn't particularly make any inroads into the business market. But the Spectrum overall sold a vast amount of machines. And I'm sure in reality Clive Sinclair did want to break into these markets, and I'm sure in reality he wanted his machines to be seen as more serious. But by that time, Acorn and Sinclair had found their own niche, and that niche was good. That was a running niche. That was a niche that they should have kind of stuck to, rather than what happened later in their lives of the Acorn and Sinclair saga. But again, they were both good machines, and I'm almost certain that Acorn would have loved the sales of the ZX Spectrum. They would love this to have the same volume, but at the time it never went that way. But that didn't stop Acorn from trying to belittle the ZX Spectrum and the ZX81 and the ZX80 in the market, because at the end of the day it was just business. It was business just like any other business ever since. So why would we expect it to be any different?
Oh, I'm gratified so many parents could come along to learn a little about microcomputers. Your girls are already at home amongst the ROMs and the RAMs. Did I say something funny, Mrs. McAllister? First, let us examine one of the finest micros, the Electron from Acorn. It's as fast as a business computer, and it has a real keyboard. Flies the tune in, darling. Notice how it can grow and observe the color graphics. They would have warmed the heart of Michelangelo. You are familiar with Michelangelo, Mrs. Gale? That's a wicked rumor. Quite. Above all, the Electron uses the same language your girls use at school, BBC Basic. Colonel, which home micro uses BBC Basic? You will write out the Acorn Electron 100 times. There's no better micro in its class. If you'll pardon the pun, you do know what a pun is.
Sinclair was the architect behind the machine itself, but the ROMs were an extension of the ZX81 ROMs, which again were designed or implemented by John Grant of Nine Tiles, and Nine Tiles is based in Waterbeach, just a stone throw away from Cambridge. And paradoxically, Sinclair doesn't actually own the ROMs or the license to the ROM, because John Grant or Nine Tiles owns the ROMs themselves. And apart from that, the actual design of the casing and the design of the look of Sinclair products were designed by the designer of this, the ZX81. And the ZX81 was designed by Rick Dickinson, and that is exactly the same for the ZX Spectrum. The ZX Spectrum was designed by Rick Dickinson as well. Now, it's quite a really nice design when you think about what goes into the actual ZX Spectrum case itself, or even the ZX81, because it's a very big departure from normal computers at the time, and it was cost driven. It was cost driven because Clive wanted the cost taken out as much as possible of the machines, and that enabled him to set a price point, and so he would gain more sales. That was common sense, but that kind of hamstrung a designer. And the original design for the ZX81 and the Spectrum were a bit more modular, and also the Spectrum itself went through a few iterations before it got anywhere near being a ZX Spectrum as we know it today. They had a version called the ZX82, which obviously could have been called the ZX82 because you had the 80, the 81, and possibly the 82. But the ZX82 had a space bar on one of the designs, and what we ended up with on the Spectrum was the space key. But the overall kind of design of the case kind of stayed the same. It was always looked like it was going to be a version or a slightly different take on the ZX81. So the case itself is very well built. I mean, you shouldn't really have any complaints about the longevity of a ZX Spectrum or even a ZX81 case, because even broken machines and machines that have expired a long time ago still have good condition cases and so on. So the design and the materials used was actually very good. The design of the keyboard made it very reliable. The keyboard is basically, apart from the top plate, two parts. It's a rubber mat and a membrane, and the membrane's the Achilles heel as these age, because they start splitting and breaking down. But at the end of the day, 10 or 15 pounds for a new membrane and your machine's back up and running, so it's not really the end of the world. And also, with it not having key switches, it makes it a lot more robust as it ages, because how many computers that are from the 1980s have survived with their keyboards fully intact? Not many. As they age even more, they start to oxidize, the contacts fail and so on, and all the joints need resoldering because they either become dry jointed or crack, or they have problems with tracks delaminating. So that's not something you get with this, and it's not something that actually I think they were looking at when they designed this machine. I think it was more of a case of how much of the cost can we take out and how cheap can we make the machines for the masses. And Rick won quite a few design awards through his life, and they were also for the ZX81 Design Council Award for a ZX81. But also Rick Dickinson's been involved with the later iterations of Sinclair or Sinclair based machines, such as the Spectrum Next. So Rick had a long association with Clive Sinclair, but sadly Rick's no longer with us. But as I said, his designs live on, and it's nice to be able to look back and see what he did with the Sinclair brand, and also you can still touch his work and use it even today. So you have your ZX Spectrum, but what kind of storage would you use with this micro? Well, initially it was cassette tape. It was cheap, readily available. The tape cassette recorders were reasonably cheap to get hold of at the time, and they were not as bad as it was made out to be in later years for reliability, and the Spectrum certainly wasn't as bad as some of the machines for loading and saving problems, such as the Auric 1. But the reason that the ZX Spectrum kind of took cassette tape to its heart, or the owners did, is because microdrives were expensive. Sinclair brought out a microdrive which was okay for its time. It could hold roughly 100k of data, which again was adequate for its time. But by the time you added on an interface and a microdrive, and you kind of saw very little benefit for it, because software houses really didn't support it. And because the ZX Spectrum at that time had a huge foothold in software on cassette tape, there was no incentive for software houses to produce software on anything else. There were also disk drive interfaces, but they were few and far between for the ZX Spectrum, and most people kind of settled or were resigned to using cassette tape. Now, didn't mean that you couldn't get disk drives for them, because there were plenty of options. But by the time you added in, even for a microdrive kind of kitted out Spectrum, the interface, the microdrive itself, you were adding a lot of cost into what was essentially a low-cost home computer, and it took it out of the realms of being a low-cost home computer by the time you'd bought a microdrive, an interface one, and so on. And that's the biggest reason that it really didn't take off. Okay, so the Spectrum was a very, very big market success for Clive Sinclair, and it's not the end of it. We've come to the point where Clive Sinclair is now going to move on to the next generation of the ZX Spectrum. But the original ZX Spectrum was a good success. It was a good machine. It was middle for everything, which was great because that enabled it to sell. And it wasn't terribly bad in one area or terribly brilliant in another. It was a good all-round machine. Now what we have to remember is the ZX81, the ZX80 and the ZX Spectrum were all at the start of the gold rush period for microcomputing, and if we look back at them now, and we can very easily pick faults with them, but that's not what this is all about. This is all about the computer itself and how it was developed and its kind of shortcomings as seen at the times of its launch and its release and its use. So contemporary kind of comments that were made at the time, more than, oh, it was rubbish from a perspective from the 21st century. The ZX Spectrum moved the game on, and we're going to look at the next iteration of the classic ZX Spectrum in our next video. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you again very soon. So thank you.